Today on the Austrian Economics Forum, Per Bylund joins us. Per is an associate professor of entrepreneurship at Oklahoma State University and the author of The Seen, The Unseen, and The Unrealized. His new book, Austrian Economics, a Primer, will be released at the end of 2021. You can find out more about Per's writing and his new book at perbylund.com. Per, thanks for joining us on the Austrian Economic Forum.
Thanks for having me. I look forward to this.
So on a previous episode, we discussed the Austrian view of value and how that differs from price. And that leads to the question of how the Austrian view of value differs from the traditional economist view of utility. Can you tell us a little bit about the two and why they're different?
Sure, absolutely. I think utility goes back, using the word in this sort of economic sense goes back all the way to utilitarianism and John Stuart Mill and so forth, where it was basically pleasure, well-being, happiness, that sort of thing. A term or a concept trying to capture whatever it is that makes a person feel good for some reason, right? Menger used the same term, and Mises does too. But in neoclassical economics, it has become something a little bit different because now they're talking about sort of the consumer's preference sets given a number of goods and services. It's basically the preference ordering of goods and services. And you place that in a utility curve so that you can estimate a function and then aggregate those and produce demand curves and run this beautiful math on it, right? But for an Austrian view of utility is sort of much closer to John Stuart Mill, where it's really the pleasure or the want satisfaction felt or experienced by the consumer. Mises uses the terms removal of uneasiness. So in some sense, you consider yourself getting better off, and that would be how we view value, right? So I think it can be a little confusing to use utility and value at the same time, because since utility and marginal utility and utility curves and so forth, and even utils, as we teach in economics to students, it sort of seems very objective, right? So you feel more pleasure, and there's a use value to a thing, and therefore you can place it in a function, and then it translates into market prices and equilibria and so forth. Whereas for an Austrian, it's purely subjective. The value that you get from something is simply your own experience. It is the removal of some uneasiness that you felt, and you are in a better position simply because that is removed.
So it's fair to say then utility is probably something that's mathematical. You know, in a previous episode we talked about how you go to the grocery store or the fish market, and you know, you're going to buy fish, and you know, utility would be how many fish can I get for my dollar, right? And emotion's not factored into utility, and that's the nice thing about it for the traditional economists is, you know, they can boil it down to a formula. But you know, more goes into it than that. You know, maybe I care about the appearance of the fish, or does my family think I'm a good cook? And value goes into much more than what's possible to capture in a formula. But the two are inevitably linked. And we have a great quote here.
Yeah,
go ahead.
Yeah, no, that's exactly right. And I mean, the way the mainstreamers use the term, it is really the preference ordering of the goods that are already on display, or the goods that even worse, the analyst knows are in the store. And there you can maximize your utility by simply picking the goods. Well, for an actual consumer, and the way we see it in Austrian economics, it's really about the consumer's imagination of how they can become more satisfied in whatever sense. So they can have some emotional impulse someday, going for something completely different in the store, or they just see something which has a nice color, or maybe they enter the store in love and suddenly they want something differently, or something sweet, or whatever. I mean, all of those things play into our purchasing behavior, our consumption behavior. It's not an ordering that is, it's not static, and it's also it's something that we figure out in the moment very often. when we are exposed to a new good that we haven't seen before, because it's placed differently, perhaps because it's priced differently, because it's advertised differently, because it wasn't there before, or what have you. All of those things affect our behavior in the store, and it also affects how we pick a store, or if we go to the store. All of those things are important too.
So utility is kind of cold and calculating. There's no emotion. That's one aspect, but it also requires universal perfect knowledge, right? I've got to know that I can get the fish cheaper down the street and that they're the same quality or not. And maybe the fish taste a little different, and I just don't know that ahead of time. So utility is really something that's very abstract. Just it seems as a way to be simple for mathematical purposes, whereas value is something that's really personal to you, and frankly, your information can change, your budget can change, and your desires and emotions can change. And I imagine marketing has perceived value has a little bit to do with marketing as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I couldn't agree more.
And so to try to tie utility and value all together and get a better view of it, we've got this quote from The Theory of Money and Credit. It's a book by Ludwig von Mises from 1912. And he says that the marginal utility of money to any individual, i.e. the marginal utility derivable from the goods that can be obtained with the given quantity of money or that must be surrendered for the required money, presupposes a certain exchange value of the money. So the latter cannot be derived from the former. For our audience, this show is designed for people that are not economists by trade to try to explain in English. What is Ludwig von Mises trying to say here about the relationship between utility and value?
Well, what he's saying here is really that the value of money, or how the use of money for you, is what you expect to be able to get in the market for it, right? Because we don't consume money. Money is a means. It's a means to acquire goods. It's a means to get goods that we can then directly satisfy our wants. And we want to hold money for the simple reason that we can use them for purchases. So the value is the actual experience of the good that we get. And we use money as a common means of exchange, so that we can buy different types of goods, and we can compare them as well. So we have a limited number of dollars or gold coins or what have you, and we have different options that we see that could satisfy our wants, that would give us different amounts, let's call it, of pleasure. And then we will pick whatever is the best for us in that moment, or we might even choose to wait because we think that we can get more out of it later on. But money itself is really just a means to get to some desired end.
So tying this back to the previous conversation, we talked about the difference between value and price on a previous episode, and then now looking at the difference between utility and value and price. Price is what you've got to pay in the competitive market, how much money you're willing to give up for that perceived value. And that perceived value may or may not include the actual functional utility, but the utility almost never includes the value. Is that a fair way to summarize that?
Sure. Why not? I mean, also the price is really a function of value, right? Because a consumer will not want to give up money unless they think that it will get more value out of it than other options, right? So the value that they expect from the goods that they expect to be able to buy in the market, that value sets the limit for the price they're willing to pay for the good, right? So I often teach my students that a common mistake by entrepreneurs is that they want to produce a certain product, so they start counting, how much will it cost to produce it? And then they add a profit margin and they get the price. And then, of course, they need to find a consumer who values it higher than that price. Well, it's exactly the opposite, right? So you have to start with, what type of value can I provide the customer? And I have certain skills and whatever. So you might be starting a business in a certain realm. But what value can I provide them? Okay, what price can I potentially sell the good that provides them with this value? It has to be lower by a certain amount. And then my job as an entrepreneur is to figure out at what costs can I produce this good, and can I make a profit, right? So it's exactly the other way around. So value determines the price, which in turn is how you, well, it directs you as an entrepreneur to what costs you can assume.
So, talking about the value and price, and economists throw around this term marginal value and marginal utility, and how does that play into the calculation? What does marginal mean?
Well, marginal means simply that the next unit, in a sense, right? So, if you are in a market for eggs, for instance, say you're eating eggs and you're eating them one by one, then the first egg that you buy is worth most to you because that's going to satisfy the most highly valued end. The second egg you buy is going to satisfy, well, another end that is less valuable, and so forth. Well, now, if you have enough money and you choose to buy, say, 4 eggs, you're gonna value them all 4 according to the value that the 4th egg will satisfy, right? So if you can only buy 3, then you're going to value those eggs higher because the third highest valued end that you can use an egg for is higher than the 4th, right? So the marginal utility means simply the last unit or the next unit that you can buy or use, and that's how we make decisions, right? It's never the case as classical economists had the problem with why water is so important for us as human beings to survive, whereas diamonds are so dear. Why do diamonds come at a high price when we can hardly use diamonds, whereas water is necessary for life? Well, it's because we value the marginal unit, right? So there's plenty of water around, and we usually have quite a bit of water. We are not walking around on the verge of dying from thirst every day. So the next glass of water that we can buy or acquire in some sense is not worth a whole lot to us. But a diamond, it doesn't come. We don't come across diamonds every day, which means the next diamond I can pick up is potentially very valuable to me compared to the next unit of water. Right, so it's pretty easy with the marginal analysis, which was the whole revolution in the 1870s, to see that, oh, wait a minute, we are actually making these decisions on the margin, the next unit of all these different options we have, not the whole concept. Right, it's not that water itself is so important to us, so we would be willing to buy it for everything we own. No, because we've already had a bunch of water. We know that there's water available in other places, and the next unit, it doesn't matter all that much. Maybe I'm not that thirsty.
Yeah, so relative scarcity comes into play, and maybe that's a topic for another episode. So I think that's a great overview of utility and value, and a little bit of price thrown in there. And for the people who study traditional schools of economic thought, value just doesn't come into play. The subjectivity of human desires and wants just doesn't come into play. But I would take all the diamonds I could get, right? But of course, if I was in the desert and it was more relatively scarce, water may be more important. But so moving on to our next topic, which is the role of the entrepreneur and the theory of economic growth and the specialization of labor versus the division of labor. Whenever we think about the division of labor, I think about a warehouse where there's a group of people, maybe they're doing the same task over and over, but we've scaled up, we've brought in 10 more people. We can move 15 more widgets at the Amazon warehouse or whatever it is, and it's not necessarily skilled. You're just adding more bodies to throw at the problem, and that's a little bit different from specialization. When I think specialization, I think about an architect or somebody sitting behind a computer with a CAD program, maybe an engineer, doing something that's highly skilled and highly educated and very very specialized. Can you draw a contrast between those two and tie it back together?
Yeah, sure you can. I mean, in a sense, specialization just means a narrowing of your expertise and your competency, right? So the more specialized you are, the lesser things you can do in a sense, but you're much more, you have a much greater expertise in what it is you're doing. So it could mean that you have put much more training into the thing and you become sort of an expert. Like myself with a PhD in economics, well, I can do economics lectures and I can write papers on economics. That's pretty darn specialized, and I have deep knowledge in this field and so forth. whereas someone else might be less specialized and might be doing a whole lot of different things. Like a handyman, for instance, would be much less specialized because they do all kinds of things that people want help with, right? Or back in the day when you were running your own farm and there were no tractors or anything, you were doing pretty much everything, right? If there was a hole in the roof, you fixed it. If the animal was sick, you fixed that somehow, and you did all these things, right? So we're not very specialized. The point is that when we specialize, we become better at what we're doing and we become much more productive. So that's the reason we do this. And division of labor means simply that, well, if you have a production process, you can have people specialize in different parts of it. So basically, we cut up the process. Instead of doing everything ourselves, we let people or hire people or coordinate people in this process to do specialized parts of it. So they become really good at it. And also, they can do the same thing over and over again. And Adam Smith talked about this back 250 years ago in the pin factory, how you could have 19 different operations being done by 10 people, I think, and you increased productivity by some 2,300 times instead of having one person produce a whole pin himself. Why? Well, because when you focus on a simple task, you are going to be much more effective at doing it. You're going to learn and acquire new skills. And you're also going to, since it is more specialized and a much more narrowly defined task, it's so much easier to figure out a way to automate it too. So you're going to figure out new types of tools, and you go, maybe I can produce this tool, which would make me much more productive in this area. Or someone else might discover that too. So specialization and division of labor, both, they're super important to understand the modern economy and where our prosperity comes from.
Yeah, so we just saw some video of an assembly line. I think that's a great example of the division of labor and specialization. Maybe not the high levels of specialization of an engineer, but if you're working on an automobile factory, you might be putting in tires. Somebody else might be putting in the transmission. Somebody else might be painting the chassis, right? If you're working in a laptop factory, somebody's putting in the motherboard. Somebody's wiring up the screens. Somebody's doing QA. And because they're specialized, even though it's not highly skilled, but because they're specialized, they can do it faster and better. But then, of course, you've got the concept of the theory of economic growth and how entrepreneurship plays into that. And, historically, they've talked about how this specialization is kind of like a stair step, and all the stairs are even, and it's a continuous growing pattern. But I know in your book, you talk about how that's not necessarily the case. Can you tell us a little bit about that from your book?
Right. So the common theory is that, well, with population growth, basically, you get more specialization because you have more people, and then they can split tasks between them pretty much. Right. So imagine if you have one big production process or one big farm, and the more kids you have, well, the more different tasks you can cover with one kid, pretty much. Right. So that's the standard theory that goes back all the way to Adam Smith. What I do in my book, The Problem of Production, A New Theory of the Firm, is talk about how the market really takes leaps forward in terms of specialization. Now, what an entrepreneur really does in terms of productivity and production in the market itself is to introduce a new type of production process, a new way of producing some value that hasn't been seen before, and that you can't simply just buy parts of and assemble really quickly, but instead it's a novelty, it's an innovation. You're producing either a new good or producing an old good in a new way that hasn't been done before. So the entrepreneur imagines a new type of division of labor and probably new specializations as well. And then just to make this happen, to realize this innovation, they have to assume the financial responsibility and hire all these people and probably train them too. And that's how I explain the role of the firm in the economy, and also where economic growth comes from. Because if this is successful, if this entrepreneur makes a lot of money, obviously others are going to copy it. And then eventually the market these businesses are going to be subsumed in the market, and the market is going to adopt this new level of specialization, if you will.
And I think the classic example of that is the automobile, right? It was a strategic inflection point in transportation. It was a dramatic shift from the horse and carriage, in terms of efficiency and speed. But then alongside that also came the assembly line, and that was revolutionary for Henry Ford. But eventually the entire market copied that. Another example I can think of is with SpaceX with Elon Musk. He went and got all the engineers to build a space program, and then went out and did something that no other government had done in the world, which is he made a reusable rocket. And he failed several times and almost went bankrupt doing it. There was a huge risk, but he was able to bring a new process to bear that's going to change the economics of going to space. What do you think about those two examples?
No, I think those are great. I mean, any disruptive innovation, in a sense, is really this, right? You can explain it in terms of the division of labor and the specializations that go into it. And SpaceX is a good example. I mean, he envisioned a new way of producing rockets and using rockets, right? That he thought was going to be much less costly. So there was money in it and a lot of an efficiency gain in a sense, right? But he knew that he could probably make this happen by putting people together in a new way and letting people discover how to do this using sort of his imagination and that sort of vision that he had, and alongside with whatever engineers and experts that he knew or hired or what have you, all these things. And then they organized a type of production process where they tried to figure out exactly how to do this. And that's exactly it, right? It starts with being fully in-house, whereas when now you see different businesses are competing, and I bet we will see that others are creating their own rocket companies and other things, which means they will be starting to possibly trade with each other and maybe outsource some parts of it and so forth. So the market is going to catch up with this division of labor that is happening within SpaceX right now.
Yeah, and there's a great video with Elon Musk where he talks about all the good engineers didn't think that was possible, and all the bad ones weren't worth hiring. So he was his own chief engineer. He had the vision and the drive, and took the risk. I mean, he almost went bankrupt funding Tesla and SpaceX, and he's been pretty well rewarded for that risk because he turned out to be right. And I think that's an aspect of entrepreneurship that's missed in a lot of economics, is that there's huge risk. And frankly, some schools of economic thought don't even talk about the entrepreneur.
Yeah, exactly. And when they do, it's usually in terms of simply more new businesses, which doesn't make any sense because that doesn't explain much at all. Because you can have, I live in Tulsa, Oklahoma, so if we suddenly have 50 new dry cleaners in Tulsa, that's not going to change a whole lot, right? And probably they will go out of business pretty soon too. And that's what you would measure in much of economic analysis, but it doesn't really change the economy a whole lot. Yeah, people might have a shorter trip to the dry cleaners, but it's not going to be disruptive in any sense. So it's missing the point, the core point of entrepreneurship, really.
Yeah, so maybe it's a little bit better on price because there's more of them. Maybe it's a little bit better on convenience because one is closer. But the value proposition fundamentally hasn't changed for the consumer. Maybe there's some convenience and price examples there. Some efficiencies are gained, but it's just not a revolution for the consumer. So with that, let's move on to our last topic, which is the role of government regulations in economics and how they affect the supply. Do they impair the supply or do they improve the supply? What does government regulations do to the supply and demand curve for the consumer?
Well, I mean, what the problem with regulations is that we tend to think of them in terms of the rhetoric that policymakers use to sell them to us, right? So it's usually in terms of safety or something like that. But what a regulation really is, if you look at it, is it's a restriction, right? The government is basically saying that, excuse me, that you cannot do this thing or you cannot do it in this way. That's the only thing that a regulation is, right? Or maybe the opposite, that if you want to do this, you have to do it this particular way, which means that any regulation automatically prohibits entrepreneurship right there, right? So anything that is restricted, well, you're not going to see a whole lot of novelty, a whole lot of innovation in that space. You might see some innovation in trying to get around the regulation, but that is value created because value has already been taken away because of the regulation. So it's important to realize what a regulation is to begin with, and then you can pretty soon see how regulations affect supply as well, because it does distort the economy, it does distort supply, it does um, make the whole production apparatus of the economy deviate.
So you're talking about government regulation and how that impacts price and prohibits competition. The famous example is Heinz ketchup. They came up with a way to transport their ketchup and refrigerate it without having these preservatives. And then so the government went on to ban the preservatives, which gave them a window of a virtual monopoly for ketchup and kind of eliminate others from the market. Can you talk about that example a little bit?
Well, sure. I mean, and this is one of those where the rhetoric seems to be in favor of consumers, right? It seems to shift production to what consumers should have: healthier food, no preservatives, and all this stuff. But what you're missing is that if you can't produce with preservatives, you also cannot innovate using preservatives. There might be new goods and services that are much more valuable to consumers that might require, at least in the first stage, preservatives to make it at all marketable. Now, if you prohibit it, as was the case here, then you're not going to see these new products at all, because entrepreneurs cannot innovate those. Or if they can, maybe they can do it only by skipping that first stage, which would potentially fund going to the second stage, right? So the bar is much higher for other entrepreneurs. And of course, then you have the incumbent, in this case, Heinz, who benefit a lot because suddenly their competition is outlawed. So they're making a lot of more money. They're basically protected monopoly because government is trying to save consumers. And we all know that monopoly protected one does not really serve consumers very well, right? They get fewer goods at higher prices. So we lose at both ends, right? So ketchup prices are higher than they otherwise would be, and we're not seeing new types of ketchups or other types of products that would have emerged otherwise.
So there's an opportunity cost with regulation. It's what I've heard economists talk about, listening for the dogs that don't bark, right? If your neighbor gets robbed and they have a dog and the dogs don't bark, and the next day they found out that they're robbed and the dogs are there, well, then the dogs probably knew the people that robbed them, right? There's an opportunity cost there, but there's a cost to the consumer too. And we've got a great chart here that we're going to bring up. And this is from a study out of George Mason University by Dr. Chambers and Dr. Collins. And what they did is they looked at the total number of regulations versus the prices, and they equalized it for the input so that those were not a factor, or they were minimized as much as possible. And part of their results, they said, our results strongly support the assertion that regulatory restrictions promote inflation across socioeconomic spectrum, as measured by changes in the cost of the basket of goods and the services purchased by various income groups. And then they went on to say that the higher regulated industries tend to be more inelastic in demand and disproportionately affect the lower socioeconomic groups, whether that's energy or food or transportation. And they went on to comment and say, well, these groups are the most price sensitive, so they're less likely to pay the premium for those edge cases, whether they be safety or quality. Is this what you found as well?
Well, absolutely. And what I focus on is really what this study is missing, because this is standard economics, that regulations harm consumers, and it especially harms poor consumers and people who are not affluent and have an easy time already. So it always harms those who are worst off already. And of course, prices go up. There's less accessibility, less access to goods. But there's also this other, which in my book I refer to as the unrealized, and those are the goods that never happen. And what would happen in a market where it's not regulated is that entrepreneurs will not simply compete head to head on a standardized good, because frankly, when I teach my students, it's stupid to be an entrepreneur and enter a market where there's already competition. That's sort of a red ocean strategy. You're doing exactly the same thing as everybody else. The only thing you can do is compete on price. Well, that doesn't change a whole lot. It's like we talked about the dry cleaners before. Yeah, it will lower the price for consumers, but there's nothing really new happening, right? And if you regulate a market space, you're not going to get the new. So you're not going to get entrepreneurs in innovating a new type of good and figuring out a new way of doing things. So basically, what Uber did to taxi cab companies, right? So they were regulated. They were, I mean, dirty cars, hardly ever available, high prices, and so forth. And Uber didn't compete head to head with them. They didn't start a taxi cab company with an app. What they did was, let's try a different type of service and do this in a very different way. So we're not competing with them directly. We're competing for their customers, sure, but we're competing with offering a new type of service that is that we think in a way is much more valuable to the consumer. And that, of course, completely changed the market structure. And that's the issue with these studies, which, I mean, I agree with the study. Regulations, they make things much more costly, especially for those who are not very well off already. But what we're not seeing here is the unrealized, all those goods and services that would have emerged had it not been for these regulations. And those goods and services are usually much more valuable. They're usually much more accessible. They're much cheaper considering the value you get for them. So they help exactly those people who are harmed by the regulation.
Yeah, I mean, anybody who's ever ridden in a taxi cab and then taken an Uber would testify to the convenience and quality and cost savings. I mean, it was a revolution. You know, when in the early days of the internet, you know, you don't want to get into to a car with somebody that you met on the internet, and now you call them on your phone to pick you up. But what is most interesting about that to me is most of the regulations around that banned that service, much like with Airbnb and much like with the scooters around various different cities. Those services were outright banned. But the entrepreneurs, it seems to be a generational shift, have said, you know what, we're going to go ahead with this anyway. We're not going to ask for permission. We're going to wait and see what the market's got to say. And it's really interesting because when the market speaks, then technology all of a sudden starts to drag the government one way or the other into the future. And so, you know, you teach entrepreneurship. Well, what's the current mentality around taking that risk of seeing what the market says versus waiting for the regulation? It seems to me that if you wait for the regulation to catch up to your vision, that you may not be the breadwinner there.
No, and it's probably impossible to be an entrepreneur too. I mean, if you want to start something that disrupts the market, and you're not just the next dry cleaner or the next McDonald's restaurant, then you can't really wait for the regulation. Very often, you're entering a space where, well, first of all, regulation is already stifling. It's already suffocating everything you do there. And if you're doing something new enough, there is no regulation. Meaning, if you start asking regulators and policymakers what is the deal here, they will say, "Oh, we need to regulate this." And this is what they did to Uber, right? That you cannot operate in our town because we have not properly regulated this space yet, right? So, I mean, we don't really talk about this very much when I teach entrepreneurship, because we start with the value for the consumer. And if you are a disruptive, innovative business, then that's awesome, right? But the value to the consumer is number one. And then you start the business, and of course you need to follow the law and all this stuff. But if it's unclear, well, that might be an opportunity. It might also be a potential cost, and that's something that you will need to figure out as an entrepreneur if it's worth it or not.
Well, that's great stuff. Well, you know, the last thing I want to talk about is your new book, which I'm personally excited about. It's Austrian Economics, a Primer. And can you tell us a little bit about how that came to be? Because I think it's an interesting story, and I look forward to reading the book.
Well, sure. So there are a bunch of introductions to Austrian economics already, but this was I mean, I suggested it or had a discussion with Jeff Deist at the Mises Institute. And all of these introductions, I mean, they're limited in the sense that they are usually pretty expensive. They are not for a lay audience, very often for an academic audience. And what we're missing is really something short that we can just put in someone's hand whenever they say that, what is this Austrian economics you're talking about? It's something that is very affordable or even cheap, something that you can give to your mom and dad or maybe even your grandparents, and they should be able to grasp what is going on. And it shouldn't be technical. It shouldn't get into what exactly are the processes in the Austrian business cycle theory, but rather how do Austrians see the world, and what does Austrian economics actually say about the economy, and how am I to understand this? So it's, in a sense, it follows what I do on Twitter, which is try to simply make people economically literate, just to understand the world from an economist's point of view, and not a mainstream economist. And it's not about what I call the gang sign of economists, right? So supply and demand, because you can shift those curves forever, but unless you have a deeper understanding for the market process and what is actually going on, and where entrepreneurship fits in it, and all of the bits and pieces of it, you don't really get very far. So the point of this book is to sort of create a Henry Hazlitt's economics in one lesson, but one that is an overview of Austrian economics specifically. And it should give you economic literacy in sort of a broad sense in a very quick manner. So I think they're aiming for selling it for just a few dollars. And by a few, I mean just less than $5. And it should be pretty short, probably half of what I'm aiming for is to have it half the length of economics in one lesson. And that's not a very long book, right? So it's supposed to be punchy, to the point, and easy to understand for any intellectual reader or intelligent reader.
Well, I mean, I run an economics forum and a podcast, so I think economics is super important to everybody. It affects all of us. Unfortunately, most people are forced to learn either in high school or maybe in college micro and macroeconomics, and they get bogged down in a bunch of math and graphs, and just lose interest really quickly. And the Austrian school takes such a different point of view over that I just thought it was a good message to get out there and share with people. So I look forward to reading your book later this year. And thank you very much for being on the show today, Per.
Thanks so much for having me.
So Per Bylund was our guest today on the Austrian Economics Forum. You can find out more about his upcoming book and his existing book and other media appearances at perbylund.com. Thank you.